Hi, Matt Battye here from Complete Wealth again with 2024 budget review. So this one is quite a lot to this year's budget after a few years of a little bit less in terms of detail. So we're going to break this down into a couple of sort of segments. So initially we'll just talk about what this might mean from an urgent strategy perspective. Is there anything anyone needs to do in the short term? Then we'll go through some of the highlights because there's quite a few different sort of measures, if you like, that are coming out in this particular budget. And then I'm going to go through a couple of examples. I know many of you have asked in the past for us to go into a bit of detail around what does this mean in a more sort of general sense. So we'll use a couple of examples of some measures to talk about, what the future might hold as a relate of, the way this budget's sort of structured. So I guess, the really short version of this is most of the measures in this budget aren't going to require any real urgent change to the way, we structure affairs. So probably the biggest thing is the tax cuts, but these have been, not only were they announced quite some time ago, they were even the alterations of what's called now the new stage 3 tax cuts. We've had that detail for a little while. So probably the only other major one is the change in the threshold of the Medicare levy. So again, we'll change a little bit in terms of tax planning, but none of that really needs to be, we don't need to rush out and do anything before 30 June. It's more of a tilt of strategy over the next sort of couple of years, most of which we're sort of aware of. Some of the other measures are things like, for example, the $300 energy rebate are going to be taken care of basically automatically. So there's nothing we need to do specifically in terms of that. And some of the other measures in terms of aged care or Centrelink, et cetera, again, are going to flow through the existing system. So I guess the good news is we haven't at least returned to the good old days or bad old days, however you want to describe them, where the budget would come out in May, we had to rush in and do a whole heap of changes and adaptations before 30 June. So in that sense, we haven't gone back to those days, but in many other senses we have. This budget is pretty typical of the budgets we had probably going back even to the Howard and Costello years in terms of the way the government's reacted to a bit of a boon in sort of revenue. So you'll probably hear a lot about the fact that the budget's in surplus and what that means, but in reality it's a very temporary. The deficits are going to be large and prolonged, and really that surplus is really only come about because there's been a surge in revenue. So it's a little bit interesting, if we go back to last year's budget, the government was expecting revenue of something around the $690 billion mark. So it's really that movement in actual receipts and income that's driven the expected deficit of 13.9 billion through to a surplus of 9.3. So again, not all that revenue has found its way to the bottom line, but at least the good news is a fair chunk of it has. So that's the short version. There's really not a lot to do urgently in terms of this, and it's not going to change too much in terms of strategy moving forward from a individual sort of tax planning perspective. In terms of the sort of winners and losers, as people like to sort of talk about this, look, in reality, every budget that spends more everyone loses. At the end of the day, there's no such thing as government money. There's only our money. There's only money that's generated as a result of human productivity. And so the question is how much of that productivity is being diverted by the government for various sort of, programs. So yes, some people will feel like they're better off as a result of this because they've been given, a particular, handout or benefit, or, their individual life might be improved. And again, there's an argument for that to happen to some degree, but the reality is when we're facing very large deficits and very large government debt, which we are, anything that doesn't address that is going to, in the same way it does for our own personal balance sheets, if we don't keep our debts under control, then it does impact our future sort of spending options. We have to go and earn more money, or we have to cut back our lifestyle. So probably the disappointing thing for me in this budget is, and not surprisingly because it's a pre-election budget, is that there doesn't seem to be any regard for how do we keep spending at a reasonable level, as opposed to just simply finding a way to please various sort of different lobby groups. To give us a bit of sort of context in this, I think it's important to understand, well, how much has government revenue changed over time? And if you look at the ABS statistics, last year the revenue was actually higher, so it's not quite a record, according to the ABS at least. So we're sort of 755 billion last year, which again was a surplus. So you'll hear the Treasurer talk about this is now a second year of surplus, but in reality, If you go back to 21-22, government revenue was 683, so similar, a little bit lower than the current year. So the surplus has really come about because revenues have increased faster than spending. And that revenue is tax revenue. So again, the government doesn't, unlike a private enterprise, the government doesn't generate its own revenue. It simply puts some rules in place and collects on the basis of that. But if we want to go back 10 years, government revenue back in 2013-14 was 432 billion. So we've seen an over 50% increase in government revenue in the last sort of decade. So year on year compound, that's a pretty high rate of growth in income. And when you get that degree of income, if your wages are going up at sort of 5, 6, 7% per annum and your level of debt's going up as well, then normally we would argue you've got a little bit of a spending problem. So, it is quite disappointing in this, not surprising, as I said, in a pre-election budget, but a bit disappointing that there isn't a little bit more, fiscal responsibility, I suppose. But anyway, let's move on to some of the sort of what the government refers to as sort of key measures. I'm going to sort of come back to the electricity bill scenario because it's something that I think deserves a bit more sort of investigation, interrogation. But essentially, everyone's going to get a $300 rebate off their bill. How this is going to work apparently is that when the bill comes due, you'll get the discount. So if you pay quarterly, you get $75 come off that bill in the quarter. Now, why are they doing it this way? Well, you're going to get a lot of people talk and say, well, that's, that means Gina Reinhardt and, Clive Palmer and whoever else has got a lot of, Twiggy Forrest are all going to get $300 discount as well. Let's pretend those people have electricity bills in their own name. True, maybe that's the case. But the reality is one of the reasons why that they're taking this measure is similar to when they've done other sort of cash handouts in the past. If you want the benefit of this lower cost, you want it to happen quickly, you want it to happen at the point the target, then, paying the bill is the best way to do it, right? So, and it also means that every dollar spent is impacting the bill. Whereas if you were to try and find some way of administering this on some sort of means-tested basis, there is no data that will give you that. You can't use tax returns, even if you could. Many people don't do tax returns who are in fact relatively wealthy. Many people earn a lot of income that are in fact have access to a lot of financial resources, so you could argue are very wealthy, so they would not be captured. Tax returns won't be done for some period of time. You'd have to do it on tax returns of a year or two ago if you wanted to have the data immediately. So you'd end up spending $100 or $200 per person in trying to administer and work out who it should go to, and therefore, yes, there's always trade-offs with anything. In this case, I'd argue this is the right way to do it. If you're going to do it, then do it quickly, do it efficiently. It's going to be less effective than if you were to do some arbitrary, idealistic sort of version. But as I said, there's no data that you could realistically use to do this in a better way. So this sort of does make sense. We'll come back to what it means from an economic perspective a little bit later. Similar thing with rental assistance and some of the other measures that are designed to put money in the hands of the person paying the bill, because that can seem, well, certainly politically, it obviously has the most impact because you feel the recipient, you feel like you're getting something, and it feels like the prices you're paying are being affected at least positively in the short term. One of the major criticisms to paying the bill for 12 months is it doesn't actually change anything. It's no different to mum and dad paying the bill, no different to, you getting a discount on your home loan rate because you switched banks for the 12 months, or you've gone to a new internet service provider and they're giving you 6 months free, or you've got a Disney subscription and you're getting 3 months free. It's no different to that. It's not changing the underlying cost of the service. It's just changing how much you pay for it in a very short space of time. So we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. Medications, the PBS, they're limiting those prescriptions. So, those who have access to that scheme, that's going to, again, keep their costs in that respect a little bit lower. You'll hear a lot about, taxpayers the winners because of the tax cuts, but again, as I said, they were announced quite some time ago. And they're a change to someone else's policy, arguably anyway. So we can argue about whether they're a fairer delivery or whatever, but again, these are policies that were announced some time ago. And even when that government announced those policies, in reality, all they are is giving back some of that bracket creep, right? Because the tax scales aren't indexed over time. So as everyone's wages just go up through normal wage inflation, everyone sort of moves up in those tax brackets. It's one of the reasons why government revenue continues to increase, right? So everyone's paying a bit more tax over time because those thresholds don't increase. Then when they finally are increased, they're, I guess, touted as a gift from the government by, giving people back some of their own money. So you can argue about whether that's a real benefit or not per se, or whether it's just a release of entitlements. So probably the other couple of things, I'm just running off in terms of, if you want to follow along at home, in terms of, winners and losers. I'm using the ABC as the sort of initial sort of filter of this, because everyone's got a slightly different opinion. But interestingly, the ABC have rated tradies as a winner in this particular budget because of the small business write-off. And the suggestion is that it makes it easier to claw back the price of a brand new ute, because the $20,000 threshold will be extended for another year. I'm not sure how many of you have tried to buy a ute in the last year, but if you can buy a brand new ute for $20,000, you probably don't want it. So I'm not sure it applies to utes, but it is a good way of putting discretionary but productive capital expenditure in the hands of small businesses. So in that sense, it's arguably a good measure, because at least you're applying a tax benefit to arguably at least some degree of productive capital. Now, the negative to these will always be saying, it just means that tradies will be upgrading the utes. Well, as I said, they don't qualify because they're under 20,000. But most businesses obviously are if they're not prudent with their expenditure over time, then they'll go broke. So businesses by definition ultimately are reasonably efficient in terms of that. So bringing forward that tax deductibility certainly is a benefit potentially economically, but also you shouldn't discount the fact that it does clean up a lot of administration as well. So if you've got the ability to deduct that purchase in one go, you've got less record keeping, you've got less audit complexity, etc. down the path. So it does have some administrative sort of run as well. Look, there's a whole bunch of other things, with the AIS being upgraded and some other sort of small, sort of, I guess you call it handouts in different ways. But I guess the key point around this budget is you could argue as a pre-election budget, it's relatively responsible. They certainly could have spent a lot more money and tried to cater to more sort of, I guess, self-interest groups. But it is definitely a pre-election budget in terms of it's trying to spread a little bit of money a long way. Is it an overly responsible budget? What will it do for inflation? We'll talk a little bit about some of those things in a bit more detail now. But I guess if I was to summarise, it's nowhere near as bad as it could have been. But in terms of if we were analysing the government as a company, for a company we're looking to invest in, and we're to look at, do we think this is a responsible a way to manage their finances, there's certainly a lot more arguments for it could be done better than their arguments for it could be done well. So the challenge always, though, is at the end of the day, a politician's first job is to get elected. Otherwise, obviously, they're not a politician. And therefore, your pre-election budgets are always going to be a little bit more on the side of sort of, pandering to those who might be able to influence that, in the upcoming election cycle. So there's two areas I think is worth sort of drilling into a little bit. I want to go back to this electricity bill sort of $300 thing, because I think there's a little bit in here that it's really worth understanding sort of what's going on from a numbers perspective. If you look at what the government are saying, Treasury are saying, it's probably a more accurate way to say it. They're saying, okay, well, we want to put $300 and this is what they're touting as part of their cost of living pressure. Now, if you want to reduce the cost of living, the only way to do that fundamentally is to reduce the costs that go into that cost of living. Changing the prices in a particular cost at a particular time obviously clearly isn't going to have a structural effect. And if anything, basic economics will tell you trying to alter prices artificially ultimately only ever either increases the long-term price or decreases the quality, because they're the only other ways you can pull that lever. So why are they doing it this way? Okay, well, you could look at this and say, well, what's the impact of this from an inflationary perspective? Now, anytime the government spends money that they don't otherwise have, i.e. they have debt, then that has to be inflationary by definition, because inflation is more money being printed at a rate faster than the economy is growing. So if the economy is growing at a 3% per annum and money's being printed at 5% per annum, then there's more money supply, therefore there's more money chasing relatively fewer goods and services, so the price of everything in aggregate is going to go up. That's what inflation is. However, there is no actual measure of inflation per se. There's only the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. That is a measure of prices that is used as a proxy to try and determine. We've covered this in other videos. But how does this play out mathematically. So if I've got a bill, let's say my bill for the year is $1,000, and the government comes along and says, well, your bill's not going to be $1,000 now, it's going to be $700 because we're going to pay $300 of that for you. So now when my bill aggregates into, and there is a bit of an assumption here, but I can't imagine it working any other way, that now when the price of electricity, as it feeds into the CPI, is going to be that $700, not the original $1,000. And so it is going to have a reduction in the aggregate number that goes into the CPI when the CPI is aggregated to come up with that number. So that, you could argue, is going to have an effect on CPI. It is going to reduce the CPI, at least temporarily. It's going to smooth, arguably, it's going to bring that number down slightly to what it otherwise would have been if we all didn't have that $300 come in. Now, first of all, it's going to do it once and once only. It's no different to Disney running a 30% discount off Disney Plus or Netflix or someone else, Telstra or NBN, doing the same sort of thing. So it's not going to have an impact on inflation because government are spending money they don't have. Sorry, it's not going to have a negative impact on inflation. It can only have a positive impact on inflation because it's government spending money they don't have. Why will it change the CPI, and why can they argue, and why are Treasury pretending? And I use the word pretending here because there's only one or two conclusions here. One is they don't understand this. They misunderstand the difference between inflation and CPI. Let's assume that if you're in Treasury and working on this, you have to at least know that that's not true. So the only other conclusion you can come to is that by manipulating these numbers in this way, you are going to get a number that's more palatable. You can argue that you've brought the CPI down because you continually conflate CPI and inflation. You will argue that inflation, that's how it will be promoted, that inflation's come down, and therefore what you're doing isn't inflationary because you've managed to drag the CPI down. Now, what you've done is you've manipulated the numbers that will ultimately be the CPI, and you're pretending that CPI is inflation. So that's your story. But clearly, fundamentally, if you print money you don't have, that's inflationary. That's the bottom line. It doesn't matter how you move the tables around, or all the creative accounting in the world isn't going to change that. That's inflationary. Is it much inflationary? Well, we can argue about that, but the reality is to pretend it's anything other than that is misleading. It would be the most generous way to describe that. The other, probably even more concerning, I suppose, looking at and again, we need to see how this actually plays out in detail, but something that hasn't really got a lot of press, from what I've read, certainly overnight, is the government have announced that, so there's some relief for university students and some HECS debts, and essentially what they're doing there is they're not going to index in line with inflation. They're going to pull that back a little bit and limit the rate at which your HECS debt can increase. So there's a bit of a win for people at universities accumulate HECS debt, that the rate of accumulation of HECS debt will be lower in the future. We can argue whether that's a good idea or not. We can argue about who should pay for university education. The argument around, well, if the person going to university is going to receive a long-term economic benefit having been to university, then the university degree is an investment in their future, and therefore they should at least carry a reasonable degree of that. The argument against that may well be that, well, in the past it was free, or there's other social benefits as a result of more people having university degrees, etc. Whilst both of those things are true, they don't get away from the fact that by far the disproportionate value goes to the individual, or at least should go to the individual, assuming they use that degree in a productive capacity. But society gets a benefit from us all being productive, whether we did it for university or not. So I don't know why someone going and being an entrepreneur with no degree, or being a tradie or a labourer or some sort of relatively low skilled or low education orientated work that is also productive doesn't receive a commensurate benefit when they don't get the economic kick up of being able to now do a more economically lucrative career. So that's the argument, sort of both sides. The more concerning thing is that the government, and again I'm quoting from the ABC here, the government has set a goal of 80% of working age people to attain a degree by 2050. So why is this? Why am I sort of pointing this out? Well, this is probably the worst example of the composition fallacy I think I've ever seen. It's based on the idea that people with university degrees earn more money, and therefore if everyone just had a university degree, they would earn more money, which clearly is not the case. In reality, people with university degrees on average earn more money because the jobs that pay more, on average, require university degrees. Taking someone who can't do that job and putting them through a university degree, well, first of all, they won't pass that degree to get that job. So passing anything that was a university degree isn't going to generate the same output. An engineer earns what an engineer earns because they've got an engineering degree. The IT person earns what they do because they understand it, can do IT. Going and doing a degree that isn't IT and isn't engineering is not going to deliver you the economic benefit that engineering and IT or medicine or whatever those things do. So giving them a university degree is not going to do that. But more importantly, and this is the concerning thing for me. So 80% is a lot, right? If I run that across an IQ table, 80% of the population have an IQ above 87. So if we go down to the end of this, people with an IQ of 88, 89, 90, according to this measure, are going to be encouraged, in fact funded proportionally because they're disadvantaged, to get a university degree. Now the US military has a cutoff of 80. If you don't have an IQ of 80, there's no job in the US military that they think they can productively apply to. You're not reliable enough to even, okay. So there's a percentage of the population who just don't have the intellectual capacity to be able to do intellectually demanding jobs. But unemployment's at 4%. So there's lots of people with an IQ of 90 who are productively employed. Lots of them. Most of them I would hazard a guess. But taking those people and saying, let's now either somehow magically find them a way to pass university degrees, or let's change the university degree so that these people can somehow have this university degree, is not going to change their productive capacity. We already have a chronic shortage of tradies and labour-orientated work. And so, and that's really a function of multiple generations now of kids going to university that should have become sparkies and chippies and plumbers, etc. That's why we already have a shortage. And to turn around and put a policy, or at least promote that you're going to put a policy in place by 2050, right? But it means you're going to start putting significant resources towards at least the formulation of this sort of idea in something that clearly cannot be mathematically, it's impossible to achieve mathematically. And again, the idea that someone can sit down and look at this and say, how about we have this aspirational goal, which is physically impossible to achieve, right? But we're going to put it down as a policy and we're going to start moving God knows how much resource towards this, is a degree of lunacy I don't think even in the biggest sort of handouts of the Howard Costello era is sort of beggars belief. So the reason I left this to the end of the video, because it's just driving me insane. I guess the good news is it's not going to happen. That's the first thing, because it can't. It's unimplementable. Hopefully this will be worked out relatively soon in the process, but the fact that a significant amount of effort would have already been put towards coming up with this particular policy as an idea, to be able to put it in writing in the budget, shows a fundamental thinking problem that is clearly pervasive through Treasury and the government. So yes, it's an issue with Labor, but it clearly is an issue with the bureaucracy. It's not that the last Liberal government was materially better than in much of their thinking. So the concern here is we have this situation where almost sort of by government edict, we can decide what it is we want to achieve. No matter how farcical and ludicrous the goal is, we can just dedicate resources towards sort of achieving this. And this is where huge amount of wasteful government spending comes from. We can argue about the policies such as age pension and NDIS and some of the other sort of welfare-orientated things. But where the real waste comes in is where we have this huge amount of intellectual horsepower going towards devising policies that even these, the aforementioned, 92 IQ people can clearly see this isn't going to work. Why are we trying to take people who can be very productive members of our society and our economy and force them into areas that they're patently unqualified to be in? Have a look at how many uni students are actively using the degrees they have today, right? And what degrees do we have to invent, and what standards do we have to apply so that people who can barely pass high school are now being forced to sort of go and finish these university degrees. But have a look how many people have not passed high school and gone on to become extremely productive members of society, whether they be in trades, whether they be in small businesses, hard-working, non-intellectually based talent people who are great with their hands, people who are great with ideas, people who are great at working hard, people who are great at working collectively, are a huge part of our economy. And they don't require university degrees to do so. The university degrees will just delay their entry into those trades and works and opportunities, which means we all miss out on that. It will distract them from what their real talents are. It's literally like saying we need more people playing soccer, so let's go and close down the Netball Australia and throw all the girls into the soccer team because we need more girls playing soccer, or let's go and shut down the chess club because we need more boys playing rugby, or whatever your arbitrary thing is. People should have the opportunity to pursue whatever intellectual, physical training is required to release their own talents in a way that only they can realistically judge. And for any government or any bureaucracy to turn around and say, no, we've got this arbitrary number that we're going to put a line in the sand and say everyone's got to jump over. And that's bad enough. But to turn around and say 80% of the population needs to pass what is supposed to be a relatively high benchmark. It would be like going to TAFE and saying we need 80% of people to pass to be electricians, right? Now, you're going to get some really smart people who just don't understand electricity for whatever reason are going to fail. You're going to get lots of people who the concept of, volts and amps and ohms and all this, frequency stuff is just going to be on them and they're going to pass. Be very productive. So, do you really want these people running around wiring up your house? Working on your electric vehicle and building electricity grids and solar panels and all this sort of stuff. Like the idea that we can put a line in the sand and build a community of people based on an arbitrary set of yet to be determined criteria is insane. And the idea that we don't know what the detail is, and we know we'll have to restructure to provide the resource to do so, but we're committed to the goal, having no idea what it's going to cost, having no idea how to do it, and when any reasonably intelligent person can tell you that it's going to be completely unachievable. Anyway, that's probably enough from me sort of banging on about that particular measure. There's a bunch of those things in this particular budget, which is why I think it's extremely disappointing from a forward policy looking point of view. In terms of what it means in the short term, as I said earlier, there's nothing here to sort of panic about. There's nothing here to change. There's no new tax measures around super and pension accounts, some other things. We might argue that that's a good thing. Certainly from a short-term self-interest, it definitely is. But by the same token, I would say that there's only structural bad news. Maybe the fact that there's an election between now and the next budget might help alleviate, whether that means a change in government or at least a change in policy of the current government. I guess we'll see. So if you're still watching, appreciate your attention. Thanks for letting me get that off my chest. There's going to be, we'll do a bit more of a follow-up in depth once some of this gets into a bit more detail, because I know a lot of you have said to me in the past, you want to understand not just the detail you can get from anywhere in the budget, but a bit more like what I was just talking about with this universities and particularly the electricity scheme thing. Can we go into a bit of detail? Can I say how the numbers work? What does it really affect? And how should I think about the budget as opposed to what should I think about this specific budget? And that's what I hopefully got a little bit of an insight into that now. So again, switch off. You don't need to worry about budget till next year. There will be some minor tweaks to tax rates and those sort of things, but everything else is pretty much, as we were already expecting. So until next time, I'm Matt Battye, and we'll see you again soon.